This is Ben Falk for KillerSites.com. Welcome to part 7 of our series on creating a basic PHP login system. I realized after the end of the last video in part 6 that there were a couple points I hadn't covered, and specifically I want to go over two modifications to the files, one revolving around database connections and the other involving PHP security. And then I also want to go over two additional pieces of functionality that I think are important, just little bits that shouldn't take all that long. I've opened Coda, and specifically I have login.php open. And the first thing I want to talk about is a simple quick fix. I want to make sure that anytime we have an open database connection, we're closing that connection at the end of the file. So for example, in this file, we open the database connection within the include file. Now at the end, I want to close it. And that's done with the close function, like so. And then I'm also going to copy and paste that over on the register page, because that's the only other page in our system that accesses the database as well. Okay, so that's set. And then the other thing that I want to talk about is related to PHP security. So I'm going to go back to login.php, and I want to specify, this is something I'm still learning a lot about. I'm not an expert just yet, but hopefully I'm working on it. And so I wanted to point out that we probably should be fully escaping any time that we get input from the user, even if it's simply to get input from the form and then immediately display it back to the user. We want to make sure that we're cleaning those values so nothing malicious might go on. So I'm going to go ahead and copy the HTML entities function and paste that in place up here. Basically, the idea behind this is that we simply need to treat any user input as potentially dangerous. So no matter whether it's coming through a form, whether it's passed through a URL or through cookie data, however that's inputted, we want to make sure that we clean any input so it doesn't affect our program negatively. So like I said, we want to make sure anytime we have post values, we're cleaning them. So I've included that there, and then I'm also going to go through and make sure that any other instances are also cleaned. So I believe that's the only case where that's an issue there, and members is fine. I think register is the only other place. So in these locations here. Okay, so I've saved the file, and the last thing I want to talk about in relation to PHP security is that I want to mention that when we use prepared statements through MySQLi, our data that we input is automatically escaped. It's automatically cleaned for us. So we don't actually need to do this here. So I can go ahead and remove this. And now, so you probably are going to be asking, why do we use HTML entities up here but not here? The difference is, in this case, these variables are displayed back to the user. If you look at our include file, you'll notice that we display these values. So we want to make sure that anything that they input can't be redisplayed back on the page and cause potential issues. So HTML entities is specifically for when we need to clean something to show back to the user. When we are dealing with prepared statements, we don't have to clean it because MySQLi takes care of that for us. So let me just make sure everything's all set. I believe that's good. Let me check login. In this case, excuse that. In this case, HTML entities is important here because although we are using it in our SQL query, if you notice below, there is a potential that if the username or his password is incorrect, we might display that back out to the user. So it is important that we do that there. So I believe that covers things. Hopefully that explains things a little bit better. I know it's a complicated subject. Finally, there's a couple bits of additional functionality that I want to discuss. First off, I thought it would be a good idea if we showed a message to the user. For example, on members.php, if someone tries to access this page and they aren't logged in for some reason, it kicks them out to the login page. But perhaps it would be good to show a message to the user indicating what went on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this location, and I'm going to change it to unauthorized, like so. And then if we go back to login.php, go down at the bottom, and just before we show the login, assuming the form hasn't been submitted yet, let's check for this variable. So I'm going to use get to check for the unauthorized. And if that is true, I'm going to set the alert variable. I'm going to ask them to please log in. Okay, so that will display a message to the user, giving them a little bit of a heads up of what's going on. The last bit of additional functionality that I want to talk about is adding some sort of time limit on the user session so that the users can only be inactive for a certain period of time before they're automatically logged out and asked to relog back in. So this is pretty important. For example, if a user logs in, accesses the system, and then perhaps goes away from the computer for a bit, you wouldn't want someone to easily be able to come back while that user is gone and make changes without being authorized. So we're going to do this like so. We're going to go to config file, and I'm going to add a new config variable. I'm going to call it session timeout, and I'm going to set this to an integer. In this case, the 5 stands for seconds. So I'm going to note that. This is an intentionally low value just for the sake of this example. You probably would want to make it much higher, for example, maybe 5 minutes of inactivity or something like that. And if you wanted to do that, it's easy enough to do. You could just do 5 times 60, so 5 times 60 seconds in a minute. Okay, so that's the first part. The second part is on login. When the user first logs in, we need to set a session variable. I'm going to set this section variable, I'm going to call it last active. And when they first log in, I'm going to set it to the current time. And then when they get to the new page, we're going to do a little bit of checking. So check for inactivity, like so. There we go. And we're going to do that with if the current time is larger than the session last active variable plus the config timeout then we want to log out the user. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and update the session variable with the current time. Okay, so just to recap, what this does is this sets a session variable every time the page is refreshed after the user logs in. So, and then it also is going to check, is the current time larger then a combination of the time when the page was last refreshed plus however many seconds are set within the session timeout variable. So in that case, we're going to go ahead and call session destroy. And we're going to redirect the user using the header function back to the login page. And we're going to set the timeout variable so we can give the user a heads up on what happened. So I believe that's good. And also we're going to want to go ahead and copy this, and we want to put it on every single page within the members only section. So we're also going to add it to the register.php function down at the bottom. Or excuse me, actually up here at the top, just after checking that the user is logged in. Okay, so that's good. And I guess the last thing we want to do is go back to login. Let's modify this. Instead of checking for unauthorized, we're going to check for timeout. And if it has timed out, we're going to show a message to the user. We're going to ask them to log in again. Okay, so let's go ahead and test this and make sure everything's working. So I'm going to log in. Like so. And let's wait a couple seconds. Like I said, should be 5 seconds, and then let's visit the register member page. Okay, there we go. So we get a message, your session has expired, and it asks us to log in again. So I believe that wraps it up for this tutorial. We've gone over a couple minor things, including best practices in relation to databases. We've talked a little bit about PHP security, and finally talked about how to log out users after a period of inactivity. So thank you for listening. Feel free to contact me as usual. The email is ben@killersites.com or on the Killer Sites forums, which is killersites.com/community, where I go by the username Vulcan Creative. Thank you for listening.